Hey everyone, welcome to the next Pygame tutorial. If you remember correctly in the last video, what we left off on is we're actually going to make a background, and then what I want the background to have is a bunch of stars coming down the screen, so it looks like you're flying through space. So there's a couple things. The first thing I actually want to do in this video is you see how we hard-coded the display width and the display height up here. That's actually bad. You don't ever want to hard code numbers like that because we might be using those all over the place, and if we have to change it, we would have to change it here. Then we'd have to change it in our ship code, which I believe, yeah, we'll see we used it here as well. So let's fix that real quick. And the way I like to do this, if there's a certain value I'm going to be using in a lot of different files in our code, I usually make a file called constants. So I'm going to make a file called constants.py. And I throw all of those variables in here, and I just let every file in my code be able to access all these variables. So I'm going to make one called display width, and I'm going to make it 640. And I'll make another one called display height, and make it 480. And then I'm going to make another one called display size, and what it'll equal is a tuple of the display width and the display height. That way, what we can do with display size, because a lot of things in Pygame require both of these in tuple form, the width and height. So let's just go ahead and make one called display size that throws them both in here. Then when we have to pass that tuple, we can just pass in display size. So now let's go back to our main function here, or our main file, and let's import that constants file. And the way I like to do it is I do import constants, and just so I don't have to type the word constants over and over again, I just import it as C. So I can just type in C to access everything in it. So I'm going to erase this tuple where we had the width and height, and I'm just going to pass in C.displaySize. Now that gets thrown in there. Great. Now let's go to our ship.py file and import constants into this as well. And import it as C, so we don't have to type out constants every time. And right here where I put the width, I hard-coded 640, I'm just going to type in C.displayWidth. And here where I typed 480, I just did C.displayHeight. And by doing it this way, I don't have to go all, like if this was a big game and I had 40 files over here, I wouldn't have to go and change that value in 80 different locations. I can just change it here and it changes it for everything. So now that we've done that, let's work on our, well, let's first see if it broke anything, which it shouldn't have. We still have our game. The display is correct. There's our ship moving. Now what I want to do is get stars falling down the screen. And the way I want to do this is I'm actually going to end up making two other files over here. Let's make the star first. Let's define what a star is. So I'm going to make a Python file called star.py, and in it we're going to import Pygame because it's a sprite just like the player is. I'm going to import, I will need the constants file, and I'll show you why in a second. So I'm going to import constants as C. And I'm also going to do something with random because I want the stars to fall down from a random coordinate at the top of the screen. So I'm going to need the Python random module. Alright, so let's define what a star is. So we'll make a class called star, and it's going to inherit from pygame.sprite.sprite. So it'll inherit from the sprite object that comes with Pygame. Let's write our constructor function. And then we need to run this super function so we can run the constructor function of the sprite object we're inheriting from. Alright, so we need to ask ourselves, what does a star have? Like, what do we want it to be? So I think I just want it to be like basic, it'll just be basic like pixel stars, little squares falling from the top of the screen. But I want it to kind of be random sizes too. I don't want them all to look the same. So the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to make a variable called width, so self.width. And I'm going to make it equal random, and I'm going to use the randrange function that's in the random module. And if you've never used this before, it's really cool. You can just pass in two parameters. One's like the minimum value and the max value, and it just picks a random number in between there. So I'm going to say they're going to be squares. So we'll say they'll be between 1 and 4 pixels wide. And since it's a square, we'll make another variable called self.height and just make it the same value as self.width. And then we'll make another variable called self.size, and it'll equal the tuple of self.width and self.height. All right. So now if we want to access width and height in one variable, we can just get self.size, and we have both of them. And that's actually what we're going to do right here. Because it's a sprite object in Pygame, it has to have that image variable. So we do self.image equals Pygame, and I'm not actually loading an image. So normally you would see me do pygame.image.load, but I'm actually just going to draw a shape to the screen. Well, I'm not actually drawing a shape technically. There is a draw module in Pygame. What I'm actually going to do is get a surface from Pygame. And you can think of a surface in Pygame as anything that's an image. Anything that you can put on the screen is called a surface object. Like if we go to our ship.py folder here, where we did self.image and then we loaded the image in, what this entire line right here does that loads the image in, it actually converts that image into a surface object and puts it in the image variable. So same thing we're doing here, but we're just, instead of loading an image in to get converted to a surface, we're just running the Pygame surface module to just generate a blank surface, and we're going to color it white. So when you make a surface, it obviously requires, it requires one parameter, and that's the size of the surface. And so it'll have to be a tuple of the width and height. And you see we already made that up here, and I called it self.size. So I'm going to pass in self.size. Now I think by default, a surface, when you make one, it's colored black, but I'm going to color it white because we want our stars to be white. So I'm going to do self.color equals, and it'll be a tuple of 255, 255, 255, which is the color white. And then we'll do self.image.fill and fill it with that color. And if you remember from our main file, the display, that display object we have, the display object's actually a surface. So it has the fill method, just like our star here. The image variable we have is a surface object, and it also has the fill method. So we can fill that entire square that we're generating with a color. So I'm filling it with white. Now also, because if you remember, because it's a sprite object, it requires two things. It has to have that image variable, and it has to have a rect variable. So self.rect equals self.image.getRect, and that'll return all the x and y coordinates and rectangle information into this object here. And the other thing every sprite object has to have is an update method, and this is the method that runs on every frame. And actually, before I type the code in that, I'm going to give it what I usually give every sprite object. I always give them a velocity x equals 0 and a velocity y equals 0. And then in the update method, to update the position, we'll do self.rect.x plus equals self.velocityx, and we'll do the same for y. And again, what this does is every frame of our game, it takes the current x coordinate, and whatever that star's velocity is on its velocity x, it adds it to it every frame so it shows movement. And I want these stars, they're not going to move on the x coordinate, but they're going to fall down the screen. So what I'm actually going to do, I want all the stars to actually have a random, they're going to have a random speed in the y coordinate. So what I'll do is I'll take this 0 out of velocity y and do random.rand_range. And let's say their speed will be between 4 and 25 pixels per frame. And we can, once we run our game, we can change this. I mean, you can tweak these values and get it to work however you want. So that should be all we need for our star. But we can't put it on the screen just yet, because what I want to do is I want to make another file, and I want to make it called, it's going to be called background.py. And you can, this entire background that's going to fill the background of our game, you can treat it, it's going to be a sprite in itself. It'll be a surface object that goes to the screen. And every frame of our game, that surface object has its own code where it contains a list of stars, and it'll add them to the screen and they'll fall down. It'll make more sense as I type it, but I'll kind of show you what I mean. Let's go ahead and make a new Python file. I'm going to call it background.py. And we're going to import Pygame, because it's going to be entire background is going to be a sprite itself. and then I'm going to import constants as C, because it's going to be the same size as the entire display, so we're going to be using those display variables. I had to get my coffee. And then where the background is going to contain its own star group that contains all the current stars that are on the background. So we will need, we're obviously going to need the stars. So from the star file we just made, so from star, import the star object we just made so we can use it. So let's make a class, and I'm going to call it BG, just so I don't have to type in the word background all the time. And it's going to inherit from the sprite module just like the star does, and just like our player does, because it's a sprite in itself. We're going to run its constructor function, and we also have to run the sprites constructor function, so we'll run our super method here. Alright, so the width, I'm going to make a variable called, well, actually don't need to do that. We'll do self.image, and it's going to be a surface too, because I'm not importing an image for the background. All I'm doing is I'm just going to make a surface, a giant square that's the size of the display. So we'll do pygame.surface to make a surface, and we'll pass in the display size. So that'll give us a surface that's the size of the display. And I'm going to make a color variable. I'm probably just going to keep it black, but I might make it slightly blue. So RG, and then for B, I'll just put it at like 15 just to make it slightly blue. And now that we've got that color, we'll do self.image.fill to fill it with that color. All right, and then we need the rectangular attributes. So self.rect equals self.image.getRect. And I'm gonna go ahead and type in that update function right here, temporary, just cause. We'll come back to that in a second. All right, so this background, it's going to contain all the code for how to generate stars on its own. I don't really want any of the code that actually generates stars and cluttering up this main file. The background is going to know how to handle star generation on its own, and that way it'll keep our main.py file nice and clean. So let's go back to background. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to make a variable called stars, plural, and this will equal a pygame.sprite.group. This will be a group that contains star objects that the background object has. So imagine the background object has like a backpack, and it's the stars variable, and it contains all the stars that it can add stars in its backpack, and it shows them on the screen. That's probably a horrible way to explain it, but that's how I'm going to explain it. So I also want to know, how often does a star come down the screen? Like, do we have one star every 1 frame, 1 star every 5 frames? And I think the best way to do that would probably be to import the random module again and give it like a random timer. Like the first star comes after 2 frames, and then it waits like 7 more frames for another star to fall. That way it doesn't seem like rhythmic. It's not like star, 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 star. They're all kind of random. So let's do this. Let's make a timer. So self.timer equals random.randrange, and we'll make it a value between 1 and 10. And what I'm wanting this timer to do is every loop of the game, I want it to decrease the timer value, and when the timer value hits 0, a new star falls from the screen, and then it sets this timer back to another random frame or another random integer. So every time the timer hits 0, and it always starts at a random number, it'll generate a star. What else we need? Let me check my notes here. Kind of wrote some notes so I knew I'd probably struggle with some part of this today. So let's go ahead and work on let's go ahead and work on this update function. So every frame of our game, what do we want this background to do? Well, let's work on the timer thing first. So if self.timer equals 0. So if the timer actually gets to 0, we'll do this. We'll make a new star. So we'll make a variable called new star, and it's going to equal a star object. And then what we'll do is that self.stars group that we made up here, we'll add the new star we just made into that group. And we can go ahead and do an else right here. So if the timer does not equal 0, if it hasn't counted down to 0, what we're going to do is just subtract. Well, actually, we would subtract that every time. So right after this if statement, we'll do self.timer minus equals 1. So it subtracts 1 every frame from this timer. Now, one thing we have to do right after we've added a star to our stars group, we have to reset that timer again. So self.timer equals random.randrange 1 to 10. So we're pretty much copying this code again. This is like it initially sets it to this. Once a star is created, it sets it back to another random number. The next thing we need to do, we also want to do self.image.fill self.color. This is kind of like if you remember from our main file, we had to fill the screen black every frame. Otherwise, you'll see that shadowy effect. It just starts drawing the ship on top of itself every frame. This is the same thing for the background. If we don't do this self.image.fill to fill the background in every frame, you'll see the stars get that same effect. They'll just start drawing over themselves. So we'll fill the screen, and then we'll do self.stars.draw to actually draw the stars on top of the background. So we'll do self.stars.draw, and it needs to know what surface are you trying to draw to, and we're trying to draw to the image, which is the background. All right, and then we subtracted the timer. So this actually should work. We just need to throw all this in the main file now. So in the main file, up here's kind of where I have all my setup. This is my display setup, and this is my object setup. And this is, once we have all that set up, we can go ahead and run the main loop of the game. So on my object setup portion right here, I'll put some comments. So like object setup and display setup. So on object setup, I have the player as a ship object, but above that, I'm going to make BG equals BG object. So I got background in lowercase, so this is going to be our background object, and it equals that background class we just made. So I need to import that because I haven't imported it. So from BG, or sorry, I named the file background. So from background, import the BG class. All right. And what I want to also do is make a another group. I don't want to throw this in the sprite group that I made. And the reason for that is if I throw the background and the player in the same group and I tell them to draw, like draw to the screen, like where it says sprite group.draw to the display right here, and the background and the player are in there, they're in Python's or Pygame's documentation, it'll actually tell you don't do this because there's no guarantee which one will get drawn first. So one frame you might have the ship drawn on the screen, but then it draws the background over them. So if you need to control in what order things are drawn on the screen, or like have like a layer system, I'm gonna make like a background layer group. So sprite group will be for like enemies and the player, but my background specifically needs to be in its own group. So I'm gonna make like background group, and it equals a pygame.sprite.group. And then we need to add that background object to the group. So background group.add BG. And let me do this. Organize this a bit. There we go. So here's all the background stuff. We made a background object. We made the group that's going to contain the background object. And then we added the background object to the group. And by the way, I do know that you can, when you make the group, you can actually pass in the background here to just go ahead and automatically add it. But I'm just used to doing it this way. But I know you can add it when you create the group. But I'm just used to always typing add right after it. But there's like a million ways you can do everything in Python. So then we made our player object. We made a sprite group that's going to contain all our players and enemies eventually. And then we added the player to the sprite group. Now that we've got that background group created, we need to go down here to where we update all the groups, and where it says update all objects, we're going to do background group.update. And then where we draw everything, right before we draw the sprites to the screen, we're going to do background group.draw, and we're drawing it to the display. That way it clears the screen, it draws our background with the stars on it, and then it draws our character on top of that. Hopefully I didn't make any typos, so let's check that out. So I've clearly made some typos, and I think I know. You can see it's actually, I don't know if you can see it on the video, but it's making our stars, but they're all in the top left corner and they're not moving down. So let's troubleshoot that real quick. So that's going to be on our, let's check our star class first. And I already know why they're all appearing in the top left corner. We never told it to pick a random X coordinate at the top. So right here where we got the rectangular properties of the star, we need to put something that says self.rec.x. So this is every time we create a star, its X coordinate will get assigned a random integer. So self.rec.x equals random.randRange, and it's going to be between 0, and it's going to be between 0 and the display width, because it's anywhere at the top. So 0 to 640, and it'll pick a random spot. So that should fix that issue. Yeah, you'll see like a bunch of random stars appearing at the top, but they're not moving. And the reason for that, I think I just figured it out without having to look at it. We actually never ran, we'll start at the main file here. If you look at our main loop right here, we have background group.update. Now what this does is it grabs every sprite that's in this background group and it runs its update function. Okay, so what's our background group's update function? This is its update function. Great, everything in there looks perfect, but it's missing something. Nowhere in our code are we running the stars update function, and that's what's required to actually get its, its coordinates moved every frame. So in our background.py file, on its update function, I also want it to run the update function of all the stars. So we can really put that anywhere. We can just put it at the top here. So self.stars, which is the sprite group that contains all the stars, we need to run its update. So now every single star that exists, it runs its update function. So now if we play that, there you go. So now we have moving stars on the screen, and you can have a lot of fun with this. Like one of the cool things you could do is I just made all my stars white, but one thing you could do is for each one of these RGB values. Actually, I'll go ahead and do it now. We can make it random, so it's like a bunch of rainbow stars. So let's do that. Let's do random.randRange for each one of these values in the tuple. So random.randRange between 0 and 255. Let's see what this looks like. So instead of putting RGB values for each value in this tuple, I just did random randRange and pick an integer between 0 and 255 at random. Let's see what that looks like. Ooh. It made my, oh, this is the background. I'm sorry. Yeah, this isn't the star. This is the background. So I want to keep the background that blue color, but I do want to go back to the star. So where it says self.color 255, 255, 255, let's do random.randRange between 0 and 255. Alright, and I gotta close that off. Alright, should be right. There you go. Now all the stars are different colors. That looks pretty cool. I like this. I don't know if you can see the subtle blue background or if it just appears black in the video, but it looks pretty cool. And let's change this as well. Normally when I think of Galaga, I don't think of it as that 4:3 resolution or whatever you call that. Let's make it like 500 by 700, so it looks like the actual arcade machine where it's going long ways. There you go. All right, so that's pretty much it for this video. In the next video, we'll get it to where he can't go past the edge here, and that's actually probably not going to take too long. So we'll probably go a little bit further than that in the next video too. We might add Well, I know what we're gonna do after that. We're gonna make it where he can actually shoot. You can like hit the space bar and he could shoot bullets. All right, well, I'll see you guys in the next video.